Hello, my tribe. I wanted to talk to you about some thoughts I have about SHTF and food. In particular, food as a weapon. Food is the world's oldest weapon, so says I, except maybe for The Rock. And how communism tends to use food as a weapon. If you look back through history, Mao's Great Famine, Stalin's famine, even more recently, Pol Pot and the killing fields. If you look at these examples, Pol Pot, let's say he wins, he comes into the cities and gives everybody 30 minutes, 3 hours, whatever it is to get out of the cities. And they're all pushed out into the fields, and they are given a starvation diet and given very serious consequences if they steal food from the collectives, and people are outright murdered or they are starved to death. Mao's famine, he said, well, we're going to export food, and he was given these rosy numbers, and who knows how much he actually knew and how much he didn't know. He probably knew a lot more than most people think he knew. But based upon the numbers he was told, they decided they were going to export food and raise capital that way for their great leap forward. And the land couldn't produce nearly as much as he was told it could produce, so he started exporting these impossible amounts, and more lies were piled on top of it because everyone was afraid to tell him that it wouldn't work. And so tens of millions of people starved to death. I think the estimates are maybe as high as 55 million. Pol Pot only managed to kill 1.5 million, something like that. And Stalin's famine of 32-33, where he was starving the kulaks. And a kulak there was no official definition for a kulak, but a kulak was essentially a rich farmer. And the definition changed and changed and changed. It was basically whatever they wanted to apply it to. If you were a poor farmer and you didn't want to collectivize, and you had one cow and the cow was pregnant and it had a calf, all of a sudden you had two cows, now you're rich. You're a rich farmer and you're considered a kulak or kulak. And kulaks were bad because they refused to collectivize. Well, Stalin was told rosy numbers about how much grain the fields in Ukraine could produce. So he also started exporting food based upon these rosy numbers he was given. And the fields could produce nowhere near this. So they started stealing all the food to the point where the enforcers would go into someone's home. There would be a pot of stew on the stove. They would go over, they would take the stew, take it outside and pour it out. If a family had 3 years of corn that were hang up to dry to use as seed corn in their personal garden the next year, those would be taken, and families were starved to death in the millions or maybe even tens of millions, possibly. Food is a weapon. It is a great, big, huge weapon. It's a very potent weapon. The ARA, which was an American relief organization that went in to help provide relief through soup kitchens during the earlier famine, I think it was in 21. When they went in, they were asked by the communists, do you have any weapons? And they said no. They only brought food. And the commissar said, well, food's a weapon. So everybody knows food is a weapon. You look at Black Hawk Down. And the guys that pulled up in the trucks to the UN food distribution used the mounted machine gun, started mowing down the crowd and saying on a loudspeaker, this food now belongs to Idi Amin. I think that was the guy. So food is always used as a weapon. I want you to understand what SHTF is going to be like when it starts and they begin to use food as a weapon. I want to give a quote by the current Democratic nominee. And I've seen YouTube videos mocking her for her saying this. And she says it over and over and over again. It's a mantra. It's a communist mantra. And a mantra is something that is, it's like a religious edict or something. What she says is, what can be unencumbered by what has been. And people mock her for that, saying it's incomprehensible nonsense, but it isn't. It's very important to listen to what she's saying. What she is telling you is what can be the future, unencumbered by the past. Why do you think the left-wing radicals are tearing down the monuments? Because they're trying to destroy the past, unencumbered by what has been. I want to read to you what the future looks like if we do not get away from this road we're going down that leads to socialism/communism. Okay, so let's read a couple of stories, and I'll break it down so that these videos don't get too long. I have a short attention span, you may too. This first story is by Julia Wojcichin. In the village council, statistics were taken very seriously. Everything had to be documented with statistics. So when people died, they had to be accounted for and a cause of death given. There was an order from the oblast. The oblast is kind of like the county seat or a region or like a state. That starvation was not to be given as a cause of death for those who died from starvation. The head of the village council came up with the idea to list exhaustion or dysentery as the cause of death. It would be very easy to tell from these documents who died of starvation. Why did supposedly healthy people die of exhaustion? That's how the statistics were kept. This was the responsibility of the head of the village council. My father was only the bookkeeper, and there was also a secretary. But because there were so few of them, my father also helped, and he saw how they kept these statistics. But they simply didn't care. Who could he tell? They didn't think he would leave the USSR and write about it here. My father was an orphan from the age of 11. The authorities constantly harassed him. I remember that from time to time they would call him to the NKVD. That was kind of like the Gestapo or the KGB later on. He would have to go to Chernikov, the county town. He never knew if he would come home. So we always said our farewells. He was harassed, first because he was the son of a kulak, and second because he married what they referred to as a Pole. My mother was from Galicia, Western Ukraine, until 1939, ruled by Poland from the mountains. In 1914, she was separated from her parents and lived in my father's house, and they eventually got married. So the authorities knew she was from Western Ukraine and constantly wanted to know if we had any correspondence and so forth. That's what life was like. My father was terrified of them. They searched for him in Germany after World War II because they didn't like to let victims go. This is Valerian Revutsky's story. I was a student at the Kiev Construction Institute, and I was mobilized for the harvest campaign to assist in the collection of the harvest because so many villagers had died. I was ordered to call villagers to work. I had to go from house to house. There was a tragic incident. In one house, I saw a swollen girl. When I said that she had to go to work, they said she couldn't because she was swollen. I remembered this house, and the next day I brought her my bread ration. I did it again, and what do you think happened? Somebody informed on me to the Communist Party man who was in charge that I was feeding this girl. He called me in and said, "Listen, Revutsky, what are you doing? You're feeding enemies of the people. The interviewer asked, were you punished? And VR replied, I was punished. I had to work at the mill collecting hay. It was incredibly hard work. I managed for 2 days, but at the beginning of the 3rd day, I fainted. I saw this myself. In Ruda village, there was an elevator where grain was stored. There was a sign, do not come within 100 meters of the elevator. The guards shot anyone who came up to the elevator. There was enough grain. This was a planned genocide against the Ukrainian people. God forbid. This was genocide. And the consequences of this famine have affected the mentality of our people. The cruelty and brutality with which the officials treated the population impacted the people. People became harder, more callous. These are the psychological effects of this terrible famine. God forbid. And another one, Vera's story. Viri Stefanuik. In 1932, there were still some potatoes or beets or maybe pickled cucumbers. But in 1933, there was nothing. People walked around and ate grass in the spring. There was nothing. I remember that I was very swollen, hungry, and tired. I wasn't able to get up and was very hungry. Mother and I prayed a lot, and she found a porcupine in a hole. She cleaned and baked it. I was small, but she gave me most of it and only took a bit for herself, and that saved my life. Many people died. They lay there. There was nobody to bury them. Nobody had the strength to give graves. People were swollen. One man saw a cat across from my house. He tried to catch and eat the cat. The cat ran away, and the man fell and died, and there was nobody to bury him. That's what's coming here. I'm going to read more stories later. I don't want this to get too long, short attention span. But you have to understand that the mentality you have today about people, your neighbors, your loved ones, even your family members, your relationship to them and how you interact with them is going to change dramatically. If the communists succeed in taking over this country, and they are, by all measures, succeeding, this is what they will bring. People say that confiscation of firearms in the United States is impossible. And I laugh at that. I absolutely laugh at that statement, that it is not impossible. All the people in power have to do is make you hungry. And you will start ratting out your neighbors to get a little bit of food, saying that they have guns, or they will rat you out, or there will be a turn-in program for a bag of rice for every gun you turn in. At the end of 2 weeks of not eating, you're going to turn them in. I hope I'm wrong, but history says I'm not. Anyway, God bless you all. We'll talk again shortly.